Hello and welcome to this Unit 5 video lecture. In the previous lecture, we looked at the creation of the Persian Empire and its expansion until that expansion ultimately reached Greek Ionia, and how the Persians conquered the Greeks of Ionia, and how ultimately those Ionian Greeks will revolt against Persian rule. It was during the reign of Darius that the Greeks of Ionia revolted. And now we take a look at what happens when the Athenians decided to support the Ionians in their revolt by sending 20 triremes. Well, of course, as you know, the revolt is crushed in 494 BCE, and the great king Darius decides that Athens, by involving itself in what he considers the domestic affairs of the Persian Empire, Athens must pay a high price for its impudence. And of course, there also is the opportunity for westward expansion for Darius and the Persian Empire. That would, of course, be an added bonus for the Persians. So the first attempt to punish the Athenians misfires very badly in 492 BCE when Mardonius, a nobleman appointed by Darius to command a joint land-sea task force to strike at Athens. Well, the land force marches along according to the yellow on this map, and the naval force follows the route marked in red. And things are going well at first, but then the naval component of this expedition is destroyed in a great storm off the Mount Athos Peninsula. And it is an epic disaster, and it forces the cancellation of this attempt to punish the Athenians. But of course, this has only bought Athens a short reprieve, and so by 490 BCE, 2 years after this disaster at sea, King Darius is ready to go for round two. And this time he's a little bit wiser as far as the route his expeditionary force will take. Having learned his lesson that the waters of the northern Aegean are rather difficult to navigate, Darius orders a force, a relatively small force, to embark on boats and sail a more direct route and find a suitable landing point within striking distance of Athens, and then punish the city by burning it to the ground. The co-commanders of this expedition are Datis, a Mede, and Artaphernes, a nephew of Darius. And accompanying this Persian fleet is Hippias, the former tyrant of Athens, who had been expelled from the city, an event, of course, which cleared the way for the development of democracy. Well, Hippias had been cooling his heels in Persian territory around the fringe of the Persian Empire when he finds out about this strike against Athens that will be taking place. And of course, he goes to the great king and volunteers his services as a guide. So Darius takes him up on this, and Hippias actually says, "Look, I know a perfect landing place for a fleet this size. There's a sandy beach near a village called Marathon, and Marathon is only about 24 miles away from Athens. So it's a relatively brief march to reach the city." So the fleet sets sail, and after a bit of island hopping from Naxos to Delos, the Persians first land on the coastal island of Euboea to punish the tiny little city-state of Eretria, which had also sent forces to help the Ionians. After punishing the Eretrians, the Persian fleet set sail to coastal Attica, to the beach area at Marathon, where the stage is set for one of history's epic confrontations, and, quite frankly, one of history's epic upsets, the Battle of Marathon. Now, as soon as the Athenians heard that the Persians were headed in their direction, they sent out a runner named Phidippides, who was tasked with running to Sparta, a distance of about 140 miles, to alert the Spartans and ask the Spartans for military assistance. Unfortunately for the Athenians, when Phidippides gets there to Sparta, the Spartans tell him that we are currently involved in a religious festival called the Carneia, and it was one of their most sacred festivals. So they informed Phidippides to let the Athenians know that the Spartans could not leave until the next full moon, and that was about a week away. And if you factor in the time necessary for an army of Spartans to march from the Peloponnese to Marathon, you're looking at a total time interval of 10 days in which the Athenians are basically going to be on their own. And so this is disheartening, to say the least, to the Athenians. But nevertheless, in defense of the polis, the Athenian hoplites suit up and march to Marathon to confront the Persian invader. Now, as far as the forces are concerned, the Athenians were thought to have mustered somewhere between 9,000 and 10,000 hoplites, and they were joined by a small neighboring city-state of Plataea, which contributed about 1,000 hoplites of their own as a show of solidarity with the Athenians, who had helped them out in an earlier conflict. The Persians are thought to have brought about 20,000, maybe a few thousand more infantry, but more importantly, they had brought about 1,000 cavalry with them. And this is significant because the Athenian hoplites have no way to defeat cavalry, particularly horse archers that could get behind the Athenian phalanx and wreak all sorts of havoc. So the horses are a very real concern for the Athenian generals. Now, as far as those generals go, you have, of course, 10 strategoi, 10 generals, who are sharing command of this Athenian force, and amongst those generals is a man named Miltiades, who had been a tyrant who had governed the Thracian Chersonese on behalf of the Persians. And of course, that area is located within Persian territory along the northern Aegean. Miltiades had run afoul of his Persian overlords when he decided to support the Ionian revolt. When the revolt was crushed, Miltiades was forced to flee the Chersonese, and he winds up in Athens, where his family had their roots. Miltiades had significant military experience, and he knew exactly how the Persians would fight. Indeed, he was a very respected general for his knowledge specifically of Persian fighting methods. So Miltiades is one of the 10 generals, but because the other generals respect him so much, when the time comes, they will defer to his judgment as far as appropriate strategy and tactics. So after the Persians landed their troops and horses, and the Athenian hoplites arrived at Marathon, there is a standoff that takes place for almost a week, in which the Greeks are up on the high ground and the Persians are on the beach near a swampy marsh. The Athenians know that they are outnumbered and are delaying action until, hopefully, the Spartans arrive. But amongst the Athenians, there is this nagging feeling that there could be a treacherous faction within the city of Athens itself that would betray the city to the Persians. And of course, the Persians have these ships, so they can send a force by ship south down the coast of Attica and round the tip of Cape Sunium. And with the aid of the Athenian turncoats, the Persians could get into Athens while the Athenian hoplites are camped out at Marathon. So that is a big concern for the Athenians. Now, for the Persians, we might imagine that their chief concern was supplying their forces with food and especially fresh water for a sustained period of time. So both sides have their concerns, and after a week of stalemate, Miltiades convinces his fellow generals to launch an attack, and to do so in a way that violated two key principles of hoplite warfare. First, Miltiades proposed changing the structure of the phalanx by thinning out the center ranks from 8 men deep, as was typical for the Greek phalanx, to 4 men deep. This was necessary to extend the overall length of the phalanx in order to prevent the Persians from spilling around either of the Greek flanks. Remember, the Persians are believed to have outnumbered the Athenians by a 2-to-1 margin. So that was a big concern, being flanked. The second violation Miltiades proposed was to have the phalanx, when it reached a position roughly a tenth of a mile from the Persian line, to break into a running charge. This would be very unusual because, as you imagine, a phalanx has got to maintain its cohesion, and if everybody starts running, the phalanx itself could break up. But this was necessary from Miltiades' perspective because he knew the Persians had large numbers of archers, and Miltiades wants to get his phalanx in and out of the kill zone, that 100-yard area where the archers are most lethal, and engage the enemy face to face as soon as possible. So as the battle begins, we see the Greeks here with their thinned out center and their strengthened flanks with the same frontage now as the Persians. And as the two sides collide, the thinned out Athenian center is going to inevitably give way. Now, the decisive question of this battle seems to have been if the Athenian center can hold on long enough for the strengthened Greek flanks to push back the Persian flanks. Well, the Athenian center does hold, just barely, and the strengthened Greek flanks do wind up pushing back and ultimately shattering the right and left flanks of the Persian line. And of course, those Persians immediately race to the boats in an effort to escape slaughter. Now, in a remarkable show of discipline, the Greek flanks do not pursue the fleeing Persians, and instead they begin turning inward and squeezing in on the rear of the Persian center. So now the Persian center, which had thought it was on the cusp of victory, finds itself surrounded front and back, and given these dire circumstances, the Persian center shatters, and those Persians are also going to race toward the remaining boats in an effort to avoid being cut down. But as Herodotus tells us, the Persian casualties are heavy, very heavy, roughly in excess of 6,000 killed. And what is really remarkable is that after the conclusion of the battle, when the Persians have been vanquished at Marathon, the Athenian hoplites, probably exhausted, form up and begin a forced march from Marathon back to Athens because, again, according to Herodotus' account of the battle, the surviving Persians had scrambled onto their ships and were intent on sailing to Athens and capturing the city while the exhausted Greek army was at Marathon. Now, according to Herodotus, the Athenian hoplites do manage to make the 24-mile or so trek in full gear in time to deploy outside the city of Athens and face down the Persian fleet, which had not yet begun to disembark its troops. When the Persian commanders saw the Greek army was fully prepared to defend Athens, basically they just packed up and went home. Now, from the Athenian perspective, this is a monumental achievement, And indeed, Athens will gain a great deal of prestige from this victory. The Spartans arrive shortly after the battle is concluded, and they tour the battlefield, basically checking out the carnage that the Athenians have wrought on the Persians. And the Spartans are very much impressed with the performance of the Athenian hoplites. And the men who fought at Marathon will be given many honors, and the 192 Greeks, again from Herodotus, this is the number he gives of Greek casualties, those 192 Greeks that were killed are given the highest honor of all. They're buried on the battlefield. And to this day, you can go to Marathon and see the burial mound, the Soros as it's called. So this does, for the time being, keep Athens free from Persian control. But from the Persian perspective, this is a relatively modest affair, and the Athenians will not escape the punishment of the great king. It's only a matter of time. Indeed, as soon as word gets back to Darius that his army has been defeated at Marathon, he begins planning round 3. And that's where we'll pick things up in the next lecture when we look at the second Persian assault on Greece.